The final years of King Henry VIII, one of England's most infamous and powerful monarchs, were marked not by triumphs or grand achievements, but by a slow, painful decline that transformed the once vigorous king into a shadow of his former self. Henry, renowned for his athleticism, charm, and commanding presence in his youth, had become a figure of both fear and pity, trapped in a body ravaged by disease, indulgence, and the consequences of decades of excess. Understanding the king's deterioration requires a careful examination of his physical, mental, and emotional state during these last years, revealing how even the most powerful rulers are not immune to the relentless march of time and illness. Physically, Henry VIII in his final years was almost unrecognizable compared to the young king who had captivated England with his strength and vigor. In his youth, Henry had been celebrated for his athletic prowess. He was a skilled horseman, a talented hunter, and a formidable fighter. He had competed in tournaments, excelled in hunting, and maintained a strict regimen to keep his body in peak condition. However, by the late 1530s and into the 1540s, these physical abilities were eroding rapidly. Chronic illnesses began to dominate his life, compounded by the consequences of obesity. Historical accounts suggest that by the end of his life, Henry weighed somewhere between 300 to 400 pounds, severely limiting his mobility. He was largely confined to his bed or chair, unable to participate in the activities that had once defined him as a king and a warrior. His swollen legs and ulcerated sores made walking excruciating, and he reportedly suffered from recurring bouts of gangrene, which caused him immense pain and contributed to his increasingly volatile temperament. Beyond the visible physical decline, Henry's health issues extended to more hidden but equally debilitating problems. He suffered from chronic leg ulcers, which were not only painful but also prone to infection. Medical treatments in the 16th century were primitive, and attempts to treat these ulcers often worsened his condition. Some historians speculate that he may have suffered from diabetes or metabolic syndrome, conditions that would explain both his obesity and his susceptibility to infections. There are even theories that Henry experienced a significant head injury early in life, which could have contributed to behavioral changes and bouts of severe mood swings later on. The cumulative effect of these ailments left Henry increasingly dependent on others for basic care, a humiliating reality for a man who had once prided himself on his strength and autonomy. Mentally and emotionally, the last years of Henry VIII were equally troubling. His once sharp mind and strategic prowess began to give way to paranoia, anger, and impulsive decision-making. The deaths of those closest to him, including many of his wives, had left a profound psychological scar. Henry's notorious fear of betrayal and disloyalty intensified in his later years. He often suspected even his most loyal advisors and family members of plotting against him. This paranoia was exacerbated by his failing health. The constant pain and discomfort likely contributed to periods of irritability and rage. Accounts from contemporaries describe a king who was easily angered, prone to violent outbursts, and frequently consumed by suspicion. The political stability of England hung precariously on the decisions of a monarch whose mental faculties were increasingly clouded by illness and fear. Henry's diet and lifestyle only accelerated his decline. The king was notorious for his indulgence in food and drink. Banquets and feasts were a staple of court life, and Henry rarely denied himself the rich meats, fine wines, and sweet desserts that were his favorites. Combined with a lack of regular physical activity in his later years, this excessive lifestyle contributed to his obesity and related health complications. Furthermore, Henry's use of medical treatments of the era, such as bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies, often did more harm than good. Rather than alleviating his conditions, these treatments sometimes weakened him further, leaving him vulnerable to infection and exacerbating his chronic ailments. The social and political atmosphere of Henry's final years reflected his decline as well. Once a dynamic and commanding presence who could dominate the court and control the nobles with charisma or fear, he became increasingly isolated. His advisors walked on eggshells around him, afraid of provoking his temper, and courtiers became skilled in flattery and deception to survive his unpredictable moods. Even his children were affected. Henry's daughter Elizabeth and his son Edward were caught in a tense atmosphere where the king's paranoia dictated every decision. The court, which had once buzzed with energy and political maneuvering, became a place of tension, uncertainty, and quiet fear. Henry's physical and mental decline had transformed not only himself but the very environment around him. Religious reform and political upheaval further compounded the stress of Henry's final years. Having broken from the Catholic Church to establish the Church of England, Henry had left a legacy of religious and political turmoil. The king's later years were consumed by maintaining control over his kingdom, suppressing dissent, and ensuring that his religious and political policies were enforced. This constant vigilance placed additional strain on his already weakened body and mind. The pressures of ruling a nation in the midst of transformation and conflict added to the sense of dread and isolation that characterized his final days. Even amidst this decline, Henry retained moments of his old strength and cunning. He was still a shrewd observer of politics and human behavior, capable of making decisive moves when necessary. However, these moments were increasingly overshadowed by his vulnerability, physical suffering, and emotional volatility. The contrast between the once vigorous monarch who had inspired awe across Europe and the suffering, bedridden king of his final years is stark. It is a reminder that even those who wield immense power are not immune to the limitations of the human body and mind. Ultimately, the final years of Henry VIII were a tragic tale of decline, suffering, and fear. A king who had once symbolized strength, ambition, and dominance found himself trapped in a failing body, plagued by illness, paranoia, and the consequences of his excesses. His once commanding presence had been replaced by vulnerability and fragility, and his court mirrored his condition, filled with tension and anxiety. The decline of Henry VIII serves as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of indulgence and the inevitability of mortality, and a compelling chapter in the story of one of England's most notorious monarchs. The horrors of his last years, physical pain, mental anguish, and the loss of control, paint a vivid picture of a king brought low not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the relentless toll of time, disease, and human frailty. Final years of King Henry VIII were not only defined by his personal physical decline, but also by the turbulent, treacherous atmosphere of his court. England under Henry was a kingdom where loyalty and betrayal danced a delicate waltz, and by the time the king approached the end of his life, these forces had reached a fever pitch. The once stable court had become a hotbed of scheming nobles, fearful advisers, and anxious family members, all navigating the dangerous waters of a monarch whose health and temper were rapidly deteriorating. To understand the true horror of Henry VIII's last days, it is essential to examine the complex web of court intrigue, the pervasive fear of betrayal, and the consequences of a king whose suspicion and paranoia often outweighed reason. Henry VIII's court was famously dominated by power struggles, and in his final years, these struggles intensified. The king's declining health made him increasingly dependent on his advisors, but this dependence came with its own perils. Men who once wielded power cautiously now sought to dominate the ailing king's favor, knowing that influence in Henry's court could determine life or death. Figures such as Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, and Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, were constantly jockeying for positions of prominence, seeking to shape the king's decisions to their advantage. Others, like Edward Seymour and Thomas Cranmer, navigated the court with skill, balancing their own ambitions with the need to maintain the king's trust. The court became a chessboard where each move could have fatal consequences, and Henry, though weakened, remained the ultimate arbiter of life and death. Paranoia became a defining feature of Henry VIII's final years. The king had long been suspicious, but illness, pain, and the knowledge that he was nearing death amplified these tendencies. Every whisper in the corridors of the palace, every hesitant glance from a courtier could be interpreted as a sign of treachery. This paranoia extended to his family, his nobility, and even his closest servants. The fear of betrayal was particularly pronounced regarding the succession. Henry's daughter Mary had been declared illegitimate, and Elizabeth, though eventually legitimized, remained in a precarious position. The king's only legitimate son, Edward, was still a child, and the question of who would succeed Henry created an undercurrent of anxiety and manipulation among those who sought to secure their own positions in the future. Courtiers, aware of the king's weakening state, often sought to manipulate his fears, presenting information in ways that flattered him or aligned with their own ambitions. Family tensions added another layer of complexity to the court's intrigues. Henry's marriages had produced a web of heirs and stepchildren, each with their own potential claims to the throne or influence at court. His daughter Mary, the future Queen Mary I, had spent years living under the shadow of her father's disapproval, her Catholic faith and loyalty scrutinized at every turn. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, faced constant challenges to her legitimacy and status. Even within Henry's extended family, rivalries and grudges festered as relatives sought favor or protection from the king. These familial tensions intersected with political maneuvering, creating a volatile environment where a single misstep could result in disgrace or execution. Executions and accusations of treason were not uncommon during Henry VIII's reign, and the final years of his life were no exception. The king's paranoia and suspicion made the court a dangerous place, where allegiances were constantly tested. Nobles and advisers who had once enjoyed Henry's favor could suddenly find themselves accused of disloyalty or conspiracy. The executions of men such as the Duke of Norfolk's allies and other high-ranking courtiers served as grim reminders that even the most influential figures were not safe from the king's wrath. These purges intensified the climate of fear, ensuring that courtiers were constantly alert, strategic, and ready to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. The role of Henry's advisers in shaping the court's intrigues cannot be overstated. Men like Thomas Wriothesley and Stephen Gardiner were masters of navigating the treacherous landscape of the court, balancing loyalty to the king with their own ambitions. Wriothesley, known for his cunning and ruthlessness, often acted as an enforcer of the king's will, ensuring that rivals were neutralized or marginalized. Gardiner, a skilled diplomat and politician, worked to protect the interests of the Church of England while maintaining the king's favor. These men, and others like them, understood that survival in Henry's court required both loyalty and opportunism. They manipulated information, influenced decisions, and sometimes acted as intermediaries between the king and factions vying for power. Their actions highlight the intricate interplay of ambition, loyalty, and fear that defined the court in Henry's final years. Religion also played a critical role in court intrigue. Henry's establishment of the Church of England had disrupted centuries of religious tradition and created a court divided along ideological lines. Conservatives loyal to Catholic traditions clashed with reformers pushing for Protestant reforms, and both sides sought to influence the king's decisions. Religious advisers could sway Henry on matters of succession, marriage, and policy, and the king's fluctuating favor often reflected the shifting alliances within this religious landscape. These ideological battles were not merely theological, they had direct political implications, affecting appointments, wealth, and power within the court. The broader political context of England further intensified court intrigues. Henry's kingdom faced threats from foreign powers such as France and the Hoe. Roman Empire, and the king's failing health raised concerns about the stability of England's government. Advisors and nobles recognized that the nation's security and prosperity could be threatened if the transition of power was mishandled. This awareness added urgency and intensity to their maneuvering, as each faction sought to position itself favorably for the future. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure could be catastrophic, both personally and for the nation. Despite the constant scheming and fear, Henry VIII retained a measure of control. Even in his weakened state, he was capable of decisive and sometimes ruthless action. He understood the ambitions and fears of those around him and used them to maintain authority. However, this control was increasingly fragile. His physical decline and mental paranoia limited his ability to act consistently, and his court became a reflection of his own instability. The tension, fear, and uncertainty that permeated the royal chambers mirrored the king's own inner turmoil, creating an environment where survival required both cunning and caution. Ultimately, the court of Henry VIII in his final years was a kingdom on edge, dominated by intrigue, fear, and betrayal. The interplay of ambition, loyalty, and paranoia created a volatile atmosphere where the slightest misstep could result in disaster. Courtiers, family members, and advisors navigated this treacherous terrain with care, aware that the king's declining health made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The court's intrigues were not mere background noise. They were central to the experience of Henry's final years, shaping the decisions of the king, the lives of those around him, and the future of England itself. In examining these final years, one sees that the horrors of Henry VIII's decline were not limited to his physical suffering. They extended into the very heart of the kingdom he ruled, affecting the lives, ambitions, and fears of everyone in his court. The king's paranoia, combined with the ambitions of those around him, created a world where loyalty was fragile, alliances were temporary, and survival required constant vigilance. This environment of intrigue and betrayal underscores the human cost of absolute power, revealing the vulnerabilities and fears that even a king cannot escape. The court of Henry VIII in his final years stands as a stark reminder of how fear, ambition, and uncertainty can transform a royal household into a battlefield, and how the last days of a monarch can be defined as much by the scheming of those around him as by the suffering of the king himself. Life of King Henry VIII was defined not only by political power and military prowess, but also by the tumultuous and often tragic saga of his marriages. By the time Henry entered his final years, the consequences of his marital choices had cast long shadows over the English court, shaping the nation's political landscape, destabilizing his family, and contributing to the king's growing paranoia and emotional unrest. Each marriage brought its own challenges, scandals, and heartbreak, leaving a legacy of turmoil that reverberated through Henry's final days. Understanding the king's end requires examining the tangled web of his 6 marriages and the lasting effects they had on both his personal life and the fate of England. Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was initially a union of both political and personal significance. Catherine had been a loyal and devout queen, providing stability and producing children who could potentially secure the Tudor line. However, the marriage's failure to produce a surviving male heir, only a daughter Mary, planted the seeds of Henry's dissatisfaction and even obsession with succession. By the late 1520s, Henry's desire for a male heir became all-consuming. His obsession with ensuring England's dynastic stability would define not only his personal life, but also his political and religious actions. This desperation eventually led to the historic break with the Catholic Church, allowing Henry to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Yet the dissolution of his first marriage created waves of controversy and resentment, leaving England divided along religious and political lines and setting the stage for future instability. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, represents perhaps the most infamous chapter of his marital life. Their union was fueled by passion and ambition, but it was also fraught with tension and danger. Anne's inability to produce a male heir, giving birth only to Elizabeth, coupled with Henry's growing infatuation with Jane Seymour, led to Anne's dramatic fall from favour. The charges of adultery, incest and treason levelled against her were likely fabricated, yet they resulted in her arrest and execution in 1536. Witnessing Anne's downfall must have left Henry both vindicated in his own view of justice and shaken by the fragility of life and loyalty at court. The execution, though politically expedient, also reinforced the climate of fear that dominated the king's later years. Courtiers understood that no one, regardless of status or influence, was safe from the king's wrath, a reality that would define the remainder of Henry's reign. Henry's third marriage to Jane Seymour brought both personal relief and political reassurance. Jane gave birth to Henry's long-desired male heir, Edward, in 1537, solidifying her importance in the king's life. Yet her death shortly after childbirth plunged Henry into a state of mourning, revealing a rare glimpse of vulnerability beneath his otherwise imposing exterior. Jane, passing, left the king alone once more, seeking companionship and stability amid the chaos of his court and the burdens of rulership. Though brief, this marriage had profound implications. It produced a legitimate male heir, a symbol of dynastic continuity, yet it also reinforced the precarious nature of life and happiness in the Tudor court. Following Jane Seymour's death, Henry's subsequent marriages were marked by increasing instability and scandal. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, represented a politically motivated union designed to strengthen ties with Germany. However, Henry's lack of attraction to her and his perception of her as unsuitable led to the marriage's rapid annulment. The union was devoid of passion and fraught with disappointment, highlighting the tension between political necessity and personal desire. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, initially rejuvenated the king's enthusiasm with her youth and charm, but her alleged infidelities resulted in her execution. The rise and fall of Catherine Howard underscored the dangers of youthful naivety in a court governed by suspicion, intrigue, and ruthless power plays. Finally, Henry's marriage to Catherine Parr, his sixth wife, offered companionship, stability, and a measure of intellectual engagement in his final years. Catherine Parr acted as both caretaker and political advisor, navigating the complexities of the court while tending to Henry's declining health. Each of Henry's marriages left lasting repercussions on the political and religious landscape of England. His break with Catherine of Aragon had ignited the English Reformation, fundamentally transforming the nation's religious structure and creating a rift between traditional Catholic factions and emerging Protestant reformers. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard sent chilling messages to the nobility, reinforcing the king. Absolute authority, while also fostering fear and distrust at court. Meanwhile, the birth of Edward VI secured the Tudor succession, but left a vulnerable child heir to inherit the throne, intensifying rivalries and intrigue among the king's advisers. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, were both caught in a precarious position, their legitimacy questioned at various times, reflecting the enduring impact of Henry's marital decisions on the royal family. Beyond politics and religion, Henry's marriages had profound psychological effects on the king himself. His desire for control, his obsession with legacy, and his distrust of those around him were all amplified by the failures and tragedies of his relationships. Henry's volatile temper, extreme paranoia, and obsessive need to assert dominance were shaped in part by the betrayals, disappointments, and losses he experienced within his own household. Each failed marriage reinforced a sense of vulnerability and reinforced the notion that personal happiness was inseparable from political stability. By the time Henry entered the last years of his life, his emotional landscape had been thoroughly shaped by the turbulence of his unions, creating a monarch simultaneously feared and pitied. The wider court and population also felt the repercussions of Henry's marital decisions. Nobles were forced to navigate shifting alliances and loyalties as the king's affections and political priorities changed. Religious leaders and advisors were compelled to adapt to new policies resulting from the king's desire for annulments or religious reforms. The population, meanwhile, bore witness to the volatility of the monarchy, observing the execution of queens and the public consequences of the king's personal choices. Henry's marital legacy was not merely a matter of personal scandal, it shaped the very fabric of English society, influencing governance, religious life, and the perceptions of monarchy itself. Ultimately, the legacy of Henry VIII's marriages in his final years can be seen as a combination of personal anguish, political upheaval, and national transformation. The king's relentless pursuit of a male heir, his shifting affections, and his merciless handling of perceived betrayals created an environment of fear, instability, and intrigue. The outcomes of these marriages, executions, annulments, and the birth of Edward VI, had profound effects on England's succession, religion, and governance, shaping the future of the nation long after Henry's death. Meanwhile, Henry himself faced the psychological consequences of these tumultuous unions: distrust, paranoia, and a profound sense of isolation that colored his final days. Each wife, each scandal, and each political maneuver left a lasting imprint, creating a legacy of turmoil that would define not only the king but the very court he ruled. In the context of Henry VIII's decline, his marriages were more than personal choices. They were instruments of power, sources of fear, and catalysts for political and religious upheaval. They illustrate how the personal life of a monarch can intersect with the broader destiny of a nation, and how the failures, betrayals, and triumphs of one man's relationships can ripple through history. As Henry approached the end of his life, he was a king physically weakened, emotionally burdened, and politically aware that his legacy would be inseparably linked to the choices he had made in love, marriage, and family. His final days were haunted not only by his declining health, but also by the turbulent, enduring consequences of the women he had loved, lost, and, in some cases, condemned. The legacy of his marriages was thus a key part of the horror and drama that defined the end of Henry VIII's reign, leaving a kingdom both transformed and unsettled in the wake of his tumultuous life. Final years of King Henry VIII's life were not only marked by political intrigue and personal turbulence, but were dominated by a relentless, debilitating physical decline. His last illness, an accumulation of chronic diseases, injuries, and lifestyle consequences, transformed the once mighty king into a figure of both fear and pity. The suffering Henry endured in his royal chambers was a private torment, largely unseen by the public eye but vividly recorded by contemporaries who witnessed his fragility, pain, and growing dependence on caretakers. To understand the full horror of Henry's final days, one must examine the nature of his illnesses, the treatments he endured, and the profound effects his declining health had on both himself and the court around him. Henry's physical decline had been gradual but inexorable. By the late 1530s and 1540s, the king's once athletic frame had been overtaken by obesity, a condition that worsened with age and inactivity. His diet, rich in meats, pastries, and wine, combined with limited mobility, led to excessive weight gain, making simple movements increasingly difficult. His legs, swollen and ulcerated, were a constant source of pain. These leg ulcers, particularly around the lower extremities, were prone to infection and slow to heal, creating chronic discomfort. Contemporary accounts describe the king's inability to stand for long periods and the use of specialized chairs and supports to ease his suffering. Walking became a laborious task, and the act of moving from chamber to chamber could leave him exhausted or in severe pain. Beyond these external manifestations of illness, Henry endured internal ailments that further weakened him. Some historians suggest that he suffered from diabetes or other metabolic disorder, which would have contributed to his obesity and leg ulcers. Others propose that he may have experienced gout, a condition causing acute pain in the joints and potentially even vascular or heart problems, which would explain his increasing lethargy and bouts of breathlessness. There are also theories suggesting that Henry's head injuries from jousting in his youth had lasting neurological effects, potentially causing mood swings, irritability, and cognitive decline. Combined, these conditions created a constellation of physical and mental suffering that would dominate his final years. Medical treatment in the 16th century offered little relief and often compounded the king's suffering. Henry's physicians employed methods common for the period, including bloodletting, purging, and the use of various herbal concoctions. Far from alleviating his ailments, these treatments sometimes exacerbated them. Bloodletting, in particular, weakened Henry further, reducing his ability to fight infections and recover from his chronic ulcers. Herbal remedies, though sometimes soothing, could also interact negatively with his condition. Pain management was rudimentary at best, leaving Henry to endure long periods of agony without effective relief. It is believed that his chambers often contained medicinal herbs and poultices, which were applied to his sores and wounds, in the hope of reducing inflammation or promoting healing, but these measures offered only limited comfort. Henry's suffering was not purely physical, it carried profound psychological and emotional consequences. The king, once confident, commanding, and charismatic, now faced the indignity of physical dependence. He required assistance with basic tasks, and his vulnerability was a stark contrast to the image of strength and invincibility he had cultivated throughout his life. Chronic pain can erode patience, amplify irritability, and deepen paranoia, all of which were evident in Henry's behavior during his final years. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, oscillating between bouts of tenderness and explosive rage. The combination of pain, immobility, and fear of betrayal created a deeply stressful environment not only for the king but for everyone within the royal household. The royal chambers themselves became a theatre of both suffering and spectacle. Henry's living quarters were meticulously arranged to accommodate his physical limitations. Cushioned chairs, beds, and specialized furniture were placed to reduce strain on his body. Servants were constantly on hand to assist with movement, meals, and hygiene, yet even the most devoted attendants were at the mercy of the king's temper and paranoia. Contemporary observers described the chambers as spaces of quiet tension, where courtiers moved cautiously aware that a misstep could provoke Henry's anger. Despite his frailty, the king maintained a presence of authority, asserting control over decisions regarding his household, court, and even military matters, yet this control was increasingly mediated by his physical incapacity and reliance on others. Henry's illness also had far-reaching implications for governance and succession. His deteriorating health made him acutely aware of his mortality and the vulnerability of the Tudor dynasty. The king's obsession with ensuring a smooth succession for his son, Edward, was intertwined with his physical suffering. Each day of illness reminded him of the fragility of life and the necessity of consolidating power to prevent chaos after his death. Advisors, aware of his failing condition, carefully navigated his moods and decisions, seeking to secure their positions while attempting to ensure stability for the future king. The court's anxiety over the king's health reflected the precarious balance between personal suffering and the responsibilities of rulership. Contemporaries recorded Henry's suffering with a mix of pity, fear, and fascination. Chroniclers noted his swollen limbs, ulcerated sores, and difficulties with mobility. They described the king's use of medicinal poultices, the careful attention paid by his attendants, and the growing isolation imposed by his condition. At the same time, these observers noted his undiminished will to assert authority, demonstrating that even in the throes of illness, Henry remained a formidable presence. The duality of suffering and power created a poignant contrast, a king physically weakened and emotionally burdened, yet psychologically determined to maintain dominance over his court and kingdom. The last illness of Henry VIII also highlighted the limits of contemporary medicine and the vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals to disease and bodily decline. Unlike modern rulers who might rely on sophisticated healthcare and interventions, Henry's physicians were constrained by the medical knowledge of the time. The remedies they employed, though well-intentioned, often failed to address the root causes of his suffering and sometimes accelerated his deterioration. The king's final years thus serve as a stark illustration of how illness, inadequately treated, can erode both body and spirit, leaving even a monarch of unparalleled power subject to the inexorable march of mortality. Ultimately, the last illness of Henry VIII was a convergence of physical agony, psychological stress, and political anxiety. It transformed his final years into a period defined not by conquest or glory, but by enduring suffering, dependence, and fear. The royal chambers, once a symbol of majesty and authority, became a space of quiet torment where the king confronted the limitations of his body, the fragility of life, and the uncertain future of his dynasty. His final days were haunted by pain, paranoia, and the knowledge that his reign was nearing its inevitable conclusion. Henry VIII's suffering in his chambers was more than personal misery. It was emblematic of the burdens of kingship and the human vulnerability that lies beneath even the most formidable exterior. It shaped the court, influenced political maneuvering, and left a legacy of cautionary lessons for those who would follow him. The king who had once embodied strength, ambition, and dominance became, in his final days, a figure of tragedy, a man constrained by his own body, tormented by illness, and acutely aware of the tenuous hold of power. The last illness of Henry VIII reminds us that even kings, surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, are ultimately subject to the same human vulnerabilities that define the human experience. The death of King Henry VIII in January 1547 marked the conclusion of one of the most turbulent and transformative reigns in English history. His passing signaled not only the end of a life filled with power, excess, and ruthless ambition, but also the close of an era that had reshaped the monarchy, the church, and the political landscape of England. Henry's final days had been dominated by illness, paranoia, and the consequences of decades of personal and political choices, and his death left a kingdom poised between uncertainty and monumental change. Understanding the full impact of Henry's passing requires examining the immediate circumstances of his death, the succession of his heir, the reaction of his court and people, and the long-term consequences for England's future. By the time of his death, Henry VIII had been ailing for several years. His once mighty frame had become frail, his mobility limited, and his health increasingly unstable. Chronic leg ulcers, obesity, and possibly diabetes or other metabolic disorders, had left him bedridden much of the time. In his final days, Henry was surrounded by close attendants and medical staff who attempted, with limited success, to alleviate his suffering. Contemporary accounts describe the king as aware of his impending death, yet still fiercely concerned with the stability of his kingdom and the security of his heir. This awareness underscored both the personal gravity of his condition and the broader implications for the realm he had ruled with such force. Henry's death on January 28, 1547, was a moment of profound significance. The king passed away at Whitehall Palace, leaving behind a legacy defined by dramatic achievements and scandals alike. The immediate reaction in the court was a mixture of grief, relief, and apprehension. Grief for the passing of a monarch whose presence had dominated the English political and social landscape for decades, relief for the end of his often tyrannical rule, and apprehension about the uncertain future under the rule of his young son, Edward VI. Edward, only 9 years old at the time, was ill-prepared to assume full control, necessitating a regency council that would wield power in his name. The regency would be dominated by Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, who became the Lord Protector, tasked with maintaining stability in a kingdom still reeling from Henry's ambitious reforms and authoritarian governance. The succession of Edward VI highlighted the enduring consequences of Henry's obsession with a male heir. After decades of marital turmoil, political maneuvering, and the enforcement of religious reform, Henry's desire for dynastic security had been realized in the form of a male heir. Yet Edward's minority meant that the kingdom would be governed by a council of advisers whose motivations, ambitions, and rivalries mirrored those that had characterized Henry's court. The young king's vulnerability exposed England to political maneuvering, factionalism, and potential instability, making the Regency period one of delicate balance between maintaining continuity and managing competing interests. Henry's death, therefore, did not simply end a reign, it initiated a transitional period fraught with challenges that would shape England's future. The court's reaction to Henry's death was shaped by both fear and relief. Courtiers, who had lived under the constant threat of royal displeasure, now faced a changed political environment. Those who had survived Henry's notorious purges and episodes of suspicion understood that the king's death created opportunities for advancement, but also carried risks associated with shifting alliances. The intricate web of patronage and influence that had defined the court during Henry's reign had to be reconfigured to accommodate a new ruler. Those who could navigate these changes successfully would gain favor and power, while others, who misjudged the evolving political landscape, risked obscurity or exile. The court, once dominated by the omnipresent and formidable Henry VIII, now had to adapt to the rule of a child king, guided by the judgments and ambitions of his advisers. The public response to Henry's death was equally complex. To the people of England, the passing of the king was the conclusion of a reign characterized by dramatic shifts in religion, law, and governance. Henry had transformed England's relationship with the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England and initiating reforms that would reverberate for generations. His dissolution of the monasteries, redistribution of wealth, and consolidation of power had left an indelible mark on the nation. While many admired his strength and decisiveness, others feared his unpredictable temper and harsh enforcement of authority. His death prompted reflection on both the achievements and the excesses of his reign, leaving a population to grapple with the duality of his legacy. Religious changes were among the most significant consequences of Henry VIII's reign and death. By breaking with the Catholic Church, Henry had not only asserted his authority as head of the Church of England, but had also fundamentally altered the religious, social, and political fabric of the nation. The regency of Edward VI would continue these reforms, promoting Protestant doctrines and practices, yet the seeds of religious tension sown during Henry's reign would endure for decades. Henry's death did not end these conflicts, rather it created a moment of uncertainty as factions vied for influence over the young king's religious and political decisions. The English Reformation, initiated in part by personal desires and dynastic concerns, would continue to shape the kingdom long after Henry's death. Henry VIII's passing also forced the nobility and political elite to confront the long-term implications of his authoritarian rule. His reliance on personal authority, manipulation of the law, and suppression of dissent had centralized power in the monarch in unprecedented ways. With his death, the kingdom had to transition to a system in which power was mediated through regency councils, advisers, and emerging parliamentary structures. This shift required adaptation and negotiation, as those who had been accustomed to direct royal favor and fear now had to navigate a more complex system of governance. The stability of England depended not only on Edward VI's regency, but also on the ability of the nobility and administrators to maintain order, enforce laws, and continue reforms initiated under Henry. The personal legacy of Henry VIII was also immediately apparent in the relationships and fortunes of his surviving children. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I Each inherited different aspects of their father's complicated legacy. Edward, the male heir, would continue the religious reforms initiated by Henry and face the challenges of minority rule. Mary, initially declared illegitimate and later restored to legitimacy, would navigate the lingering religious and political tensions with a determination shaped by her father's influence. Elizabeth, born of Anne Boleyn, would grow up in a world shaped by her father's marital decisions, court intrigues, and religious upheaval, eventually ascending to the throne with the memory of Henry's reign looming large over her own rule. The king's death thus left a dynasty shaped as much by his personal ambitions and failings as by the institution of monarchy itself. Even in death, Henry VIII's presence was felt through the grandeur of his funeral and the symbolic rituals surrounding his passing. His body lay in state, adorned in royal regalia, a final display of the power, wealth, and authority that had defined his life. The funeral procession, attended by nobles, courtiers, and dignitaries, was both a mourning of the king and a reaffirmation of the monarchy's enduring authority. The ceremonial aspects of death reinforced the image of Henry as a powerful monarch even in the face of physical decline, reminding all that the authority of the crown was inseparable from the man who had wielded it with both brilliance and brutality. Ultimately, the death of Henry VIII marked the end of an era characterized by personal ambition, political upheaval, religious transformation, and relentless exercise of royal authority. His passing closed a chapter in English history in which the monarchy had been defined by dramatic shifts in power, dramatic enforcement of personal will, and the intertwining of private desires with national destiny. The immediate aftermath of his death, Edward VI's succession, the Regency Council, the cautious optimism and apprehension of the court, and the continuing religious transformations, highlighted both the fragility and resilience of England's institutions. Henry's legacy, forged through both triumph and terror, would continue to shape the kingdom for decades, influencing governance, religion, and the monarchy itself. In reflecting on Henry VIII's final days and the aftermath of his death, it becomes clear that the end of his life was not simply a conclusion of a personal story, but the beginning of a transitional period in English history. The kingdom had survived his reign, but it had been irrevocably altered. The turbulence, ambition, and decisions that had characterized Henry's rule left a complex inheritance, one that demanded careful navigation by successors, advisors, and the population alike. The death of Henry VIII was therefore both an ending and a beginning, a moment of profound personal loss, national uncertainty, and historical significance. The era he had dominated, with all its grandeur, terror, and transformation, had come to an end, leaving behind a kingdom forever marked by the life and death of one of England's most formidable monarchs.